Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Assistant Principals webinar on Special Education Do's and Don'ts, supporting an implementation of HLP for students with disabilities. Our speakers this afternoon are Erica McCray and James McCleskey with the University of Florida and Bonnie Billingsley with Virginia Tech. We're so glad to have our speakers this afternoon, and we hope and encourage all of you as you're coming in to please download today's presentation slides and resource list from our website at www.naesp.org/webinars. With that, I will turn it over to our team.
Thanks so much, Honor. It is a great pleasure to be here with you all. And I'd like to start by saying Happy Assistant Principals Week. Probably not the way you expected to spend it at home, but we hope that you are having a good transition nonetheless. So we have a poll question that we'd like to get the conversation started with. So our question is, how are you managing this new normal? Is it business as usual? What new normal? Are you thinking you're zooming right along, everything's fine? Are you taking it one day at a time? It's actually Blur's Day, the 32nd of Mayperle. Or wake me when it's all over. So give us a little feedback on how you're feeling about the transitions to remote working. Yes. It looks like most folks are taking it one day at a time.
75% said taking it one day at a time, 21% said zooming right along, and only 4% said business as usual.
Well, I'm glad to know that I'm not alone in taking it one day at a time. I feel like some days it's hour by hour. So thank you all for taking this hour to spend with us. Just so you're aware, we are presenting some information and resources from the Cedar Center, and we are a technical assistance center funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, and our resources and information shared are our own. So just to give you a brief overview of what we hope to share with you today and give you an opportunity to respond to is first providing a brief introduction to the Cedar Center, which I just mentioned. Give background on the high leverage practices for special education or serving students with disabilities. Share a resource guide. It's the high leverage practices or HLP PD guide for school leaders, and offer strategies for school leaders to support teachers in inclusive environments. So I'd first like to share our website. If you'd like to jot down the URL, cedar.org, and to give you just one more acronym to try to hold in your brain. The Cedar Center stands for Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform. And we have been a technical assistance center in operation since 2013. And we've been working to provide support to state teams, which include state education agencies, local school districts, and education preparation provider programs to support improved outcomes for students with disabilities. And as you can see from this map, the states in blue are states that we've worked with fairly consistently over time, providing different levels and types of supports as needed and asked for by our state teams. Knowing that each context presents different challenges and different strengths, we go in and work with those teams to think holistically and comprehensively about what we call the professional learning system. How do we ensure that policies and practices get high quality, effective teachers and leaders in service of students with disabilities and all learners so that they can all have equitable opportunities to achieve. Now I'll turn it over to James McCleskey to give you some background information on the high leverage practices.
Thank you very much, Erica. It's good to be with you all. Thank you all for being here today. I hope you read, by the way, the heading on this slide. Every time I read it, I kind of smile. I thought about changing it, but finally decided not to because I think we all know what everyone's talking about right now, and it's certainly not high leverage practices. But at least before the pandemic started, a lot of people who prepare teachers and provide professional development were talking about high leverage practices. The first disciplines that started talking about them were math and science, then they were followed by foreign language and special education and others. And all have used a common set of criteria to identify these practices. So I want to start with that, and then we will go through the practices and some background surrounding them. These practices are designed, no matter the disciplinary areas, to be fundamental to effective teaching, and also practices that will make the most difference related to improved student outcomes, basically providing the most bang for the buck. What are the most important practices that teachers need to be able to use in classrooms? For the ones that we're addressing today, we particularly focused on students who struggle to learn. But these need to be practices that are used by teachers often, that cut across instructional content, that apply to a lot of age levels, and that apply to different learners. Basically, it'll be used a lot by teachers and be very useful for them in classrooms. And they also need to be practices that are based on research that documents that they do indeed improve student outcomes. And they're some of the best practices that we have to do that. Next slide. Now, these are HLPs for K-12 special education teachers. I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that's a little bit misleading. I'll talk about that in just a second. But they were developed through a collaborative activity sponsored by the Cedar Center, the Council for Exceptional Children, and the Teacher Education Division, the CEC. And these practices have been approved by the leading professional organization in special ed, the Council for Exceptional Children, as the official high leverage practices for special education teachers, and are going to be used for approving preparation programs for special education teachers. Next slide. Now, HLPs for special education teachers, I want to provide some information on the purpose and which students they're intended for and the setting to kind of clarify that these practices, from my perspective, and I think from most people's perspective who've used them, are useful well beyond special education teachers. First, the purpose was to identify the most effective practice that can be used to accelerate student learning for students with disabilities, but also for any other student who's struggling to learn. As you all know, special education teachers don't just work nowadays with students with disabilities, with tiered instructional practices and other things. And practices don't cut off at students with disabilities. Good practices that accelerate learning apply not only to students with disabilities, but also any other student who's struggling to learn. Also, regarding settings, these practices aren't applicable just for what you might think about when you think of special education teachers, specialized intensive instruction in Tier 3 or resource classes or separate classes, but they are also quite applicable in Tier 1 and Tier 2 settings or inclusive classrooms for core instruction. So as we go through them, I think you'll see that most of the practices are applicable across the board. Some are very specific to Tier 3, but very, very few of them. So next slide. So we talk about applicability to students with disabilities and also students who struggle to learn. As you all know, these are students that can come from any background, but a disproportionate number of these students come from certain groups and who struggle to learn. And that includes students with disabilities, but it also includes students from low SES backgrounds, certain students from ethnic minority groups and English language learners. Many of the students from these groups do quite well, but disproportionate numbers of them struggle to learn. Now that's relevant because the next slide you'll see indicates, as you all well know, that there are great numbers of students from these various groups. Students we call diverse now make up a majority of classrooms on average in the United States. There's obviously a lot of variability across school districts and across parts of the United States, but the bottom line is teachers have a lot of issues to deal with, diversity to deal with, students who are struggling to learn in their classrooms. You know that, but for me, I pulled this information together recently. It kind of starkly illustrates what teachers are facing and the need for delivering effective instruction to students who are struggling to learn. Next slide. Now, what we conclude from this, as I've already said, is classrooms are diverse. A majority of students in classrooms are considered diverse, and disproportionate numbers struggle to learn. Next slide. So what do? Teachers are obviously the most important factor influencing student achievement. I think you have probably known that. As a teacher, I knew that, but researchers finally have provided us with some information. Economists, people who've looked at statewide data sets, as well as researchers that have studied effective instructional practice. For example, Hattie claims that teachers account for about 30% of the variance in student learning. And that's what a number of people somewhere in that neighborhood have concluded. And this is variance also that we have any control over. We don't have control over much more than 30% of the variance. So teachers are really a key, as you all know. And the key is that they need to be able to deliver effective instructional practice. That's where that 30% variance that Hattie points out comes into play. And that's what we're trying to identify and define with the high leverage practices. Next slide. Now, the high leverage practice for special ed teachers are broken out into 4 areas. And you see those numbers underneath: collaboration, assessment, and so forth. That's how many are included in each session, and there are 22 overall. Next slide. I'm only going to very briefly go through those. Honor mentioned a handout that we provided. That handout has all 22 of these practices described and links to information about them. Erica will provide you with some more information about resources just after we get through. But I just want to briefly go over these practices. Collaboration focuses as much as anything else on teachers working together to improve instructional outcomes for students. As you can see, the one that's highlighted is certainly a key for gender-led inclusive classrooms. For example, professionals collaborate to increase student success through co-teaching, through building-based support teams, database support teams, consultation and collaboration, and the like. Next slide. The second is assessment. The second area is assessment, and the one that's most relevant from my perspective for general education classrooms is number 6, using student assessment data, analyzing instructional practice, and making necessary adjustments that improve student outcomes. A very powerful practice to improve student outcomes, and certainly relevant for general and special education, and most succinctly characterized as use of formative assessment. Next. Also, social emotional behavioral area. The most important there as a foundational practice is the first that's listed: establish a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment. Obviously, that provides a foundation to ensure that students can learn in a classroom and teachers can deliver effective instruction. Next slide. Now, there are 12 instructional practices, more than all the other 3 areas combined. There are 10 of those. The first of 4 of these really get at, or the first 3 really get at planning instruction. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see those that are effective practices that improve outcomes for students. And I hope you'll look at these and say, yeah, that makes sense to me. That's kind of what we've found to this point in time when we shared these practices, that good teachers, effective teachers, provide scaffolded supports. They use explicit instruction strategically as is needed, flexibly group children to differentiate instruction, use strategies to promote engagement, and also use technology effectively. And then the final slide includes a couple more of these related to intensive instruction and generalization, as well as providing feedback to guide student learning. Next slide. Now, this is a quick overview as far as these practices are concerned. And again, the handout's available. I would encourage you to look at that. But I want to just talk briefly about why we should focus on a limited number of these practices. And the first thing I want to do is to focus on us who are preparing teachers in higher education and how we are trying to improve that preparation. Our curriculum in higher education for many years has been about 1 mile wide and 1 inch deep. We talk about a lot of practices, but don't prepare teachers to use those practices when they enter the classroom. And that's been changing for about the last 10, 15 years. As you all have seen, certainly there are more clinical practices. There's more emphasis on practice-based teacher preparation where our candidates learn to do things in classrooms. And if we're going to do that, we have to figure out which practices we're going to focus on. We can't keep focusing on a wide range of practice. We got to narrow our focus. So these high leverage practices are intended to be that narrow focus so we really can emphasize and prepare teachers to use well the most important practices when they enter the classroom. Same argument could be made as far as professional development. We're often in school districts, for example, or in states all over the place with different types of professional development focusing on all kinds of things. And so the emphasis here is let's select the most important instructional practices, focus on those, and make sure teachers know how to use them rather than focusing on a broad range of things. And if we do that, students who struggle to learn, including those with disabilities, can get the level of support and instruction they need. And also, next slide, there are benefits, and Erica's going to talk about these in some depth after this section of the presentation, but there are benefits to building administrators as well. These practices allow building administrators to recognize effective instructional practices for students who struggle to learn in an inclusive classroom, and also effective instructional practices that are delivered in separate special education classrooms. Now, this might relate to a teacher not knowing how to use the practice, so the teacher may need support from an administrator in the form of professional development and coaching to learn to use the practice. But it may also be how classrooms are organized and how resources are organized and how much time people have to deliver instruction or how many students are in a resource class. So there may be a lot of other things that a building administrator might need to look at to say, these are factors that influence whether or not we can deliver this highly effective instruction. Next slide. So that's a quick overview as far as high leverage practices are concerned and a rationale for them and how they might be used in particular by building administrators. So I want to take a minute or two and I'll check the chat box if you have any questions about the HLPs, and also ask you if you have, Erica, do we have a list of the instruction? I don't know if we can see those or not, the instruction HLPs. Can you make that a little bigger?
And we did have the question, James, as you're doing that. The question was, do you have sources for those numbers? 52% are low SES, 13% are disabled, etc.
All those numbers are from the U.S. Department of Education. There's a report to Congress annually that is published by the Office of Special Education Programs. That's where the numbers are for students with disabilities. The others are for the National Center on Educational Statistics. They provide, actually that and the Census Bureau provides that type of information. So that's where I pulled those data. So if you email me, I'll be glad to send you the sources. I didn't include them here in the presentation, but I do have the particular sources. If you want to email me, I'll send you those.
And we have the email at the very end of this presentation. And yes, I will send out the link and this sheet here after the webinar.
All right, glad to. Well, I don't see any immediate, wait a minute. There's a question, what kind of training should teachers get to be able to cater to students with educational needs? That's a very good question. And a lot of the emphasis on high leverage practices comes from work related to and research on professional development. There's a lot of evidence that indicates that teachers to use a practice in a classroom need intensive support, anywhere from 20 to 100 hours to learn to use a practice in a classroom. So by focusing on a limited number of practices, our contention is, and a lot of other people are contending the same thing, we really can prepare teachers through micro-teaching activities, simulation activities, coaching in their own classroom, support for how to use the practice within their own classroom, that sort of thing, so that they learn to use these practices in ways that are embedded within their own setting. So those are the types of approaches for professional development, at least, that works best. I know we are working at the Cedar Center, and a lot of other people are around the country, to develop simulation activities using avatars, using micro-teaching, using lesson study, using a whole range of different kinds of things beyond simulations to provide support as teachers learn about, see examples of, and prepare to use these types of activities. Now, I hope that's helpful. Any other questions? Yeah, someone mentioned social emotional learning, first of all, and I certainly agree with that. I'm emphasizing instruction today, but social emotional learning, a foundation in that area, is certainly important to provide a stable, safe, predictable classroom so that teachers can deliver effective instruction and students have an environment in which they learn. So I certainly agree. And I think the same kind of preparation is necessary for teachers in those areas as well. So very good point. I think my time's up. Erica, why don't we go on to the next section and we can talk more about these practices in the PD guide. Thank you.
Okay, so we'd like to talk a little bit more about a resource that you might find helpful as you begin to work on integrating high leverage practices in your settings with the teachers that you work with. And so the High Leverage Practices in Special Education Professional Development Guide was designed for that specifically. As we rolled out the high leverage practices with the Council for Exceptional Children, we heard over and over again that these were really useful, really important, but what's a good way to share them so that it's systematic, and that we could put immediately usable resources in the hands of school leaders so that they could roll these out in their buildings. So why should leaders be interested? James got into that a little bit, but we've worked with district leaders and they have been prioritizing widespread implementation. So in one district that we work with in one of the states we partner with, a superintendent said, I want books for all of my principals so that they are prepared to work with teachers in their building in ways that make sense. And just so you know, on one of the websites I'll send you, you'll see the link for the highleveragepractices.org website. You can download the book for free. So one of the books that we'll talk about is a free download for anyone who wants it. From there, school leaders can support building and classroom level implementation, as James mentioned. Selecting a smaller set of the high leverage practices has been a really effective way for school leaders and teachers to approach using the high leverage practices or integrating them or even identifying them in some instances so that there's common language. Assistant principals often serve, as you all know, as support mentors and coaches. And so being able to use these resources in ways that make sense in your particular role, we think is something that hopefully you'll take away from our time today. And ultimately, we want teachers to be using high leverage practices to implement evidence-based practices to meet the various needs of learners in their classrooms. So we see high leverage practices and evidence-based practices as a nice pair to ensure that student needs are met. Okay, so just to give you a high-level overview of what all is provided in the Professional Development Guide. It was designed for school leaders, as I mentioned. Thinking about professional development at multiple levels, so district level, school building level, classroom level, for small groups, for individual one-on-one coaching. It's web-based. All of these pieces can be downloaded and used individually as well as the full package. So we'll dig into that. So the 3 sections is organized in getting to know high leverage practices. The second section is on sharing them. So how would a leader begin to have this conversation? And then 3, the reflection piece. How do we know that as we're implementing the practices and teaching others about the practices that they're being implemented well and that we're able to continue to layer on information to improve instruction? So on highleveragepractices.org, the website I briefly mentioned, this is just a screenshot from one of the videos. So some of the practices that were identified as some immediate priorities, we developed small videos that are used for conversation starters that can be used to help develop practice in teachers. So both pre-service and in-service teachers are using these videos to have conversations about effective practice, what it looks like with different populations of students and across K through 12 classrooms. So one of those examples is High Leverage Practice 18, focused on student engagement. So section 1, getting to know the high leverage practices. It includes an overview, a general cheat sheet overview on high leverage practices overall. There are documents that break down each of the domain areas that James talked about, so collaboration, assessment, social and emotional behavioral practices, and then a look at instruction. A number of resources are compiled, resources that you can download. Each one of them comes with a PowerPoint slide deck, so if you decided I want to start using these tomorrow on Zoom, some of these resources are readily available for you. Section 2 is that sharing piece. So what would a professional development session look like? There's some example agendas that a school leader could use. There's a walking tour of the website so you can really look at in detail on all of the elements of the highleveragepractices.org website and the resources there. how to start the conversation, a dear colleague letter, and then a glossary. So if you wanted to go in and just find some specific terms to begin with, that's readily available for you, as well as an orientation. Like I said, how do you start having these conversations, and then using the resources on the website. The third section, that reflection piece, how do we then follow up? So it's not just a sit and just get this information and hopefully you'll do great, but how do we go back and then look at how well we're implementing high leverage practices, identifying resources to improve implementation of those practices, and then start having some professional learning community opportunities. How can we learn with our colleagues and from our colleagues related to HLPs? And there were some questions in the chat box that I want to address, but I want you to be thinking about and add comments in the chat box, if you will, about this resource, the Professional Development Guide in particular, how you might use it and who you might share it with.
I was going to mention that one of the questions that came through is, what might teachers do as they are at home with these practices? And I thought that was a great question. And one of the things that they might consider is to review these practices and identify one that they would really like to learn more about or refine. For example, there's a lot of resources and videos, for example, about explicit instruction. It's one of the more challenging, multi-stepped practices, and it looks different in different content areas. So learning about that practice, maybe planning some lessons using that practice, and maybe talking with other teachers who are also interested in learning it would be ways of continuing their own professional growth while they're at home.
No, there's also a question on how might coaches be best prepared to support teachers in the classroom, experience, certification, and special education. It's a very good question. And of course, the basics for coaches is that they have a clear model. The model is effective. And the coach understands how to use the model and interact effectively with teachers. So it's pretty standard kind of stuff there. But from my perspective, experience and certification in special ed isn't necessarily needed with the high leverage practices we're talking about. The real key is, can the coach use that practice in his or her classroom and then prepare someone else to use it? These are certainly practices that will cut across people in different certification areas and so forth. So someone that's effective in working with struggling learners, I think, could be a very fine coach, depending on the particular practice and their expertise in relation to using that practice. So good question. Thank you for that.
And in terms of coaching and PD, it might also be helpful if everybody was on the same page in the district about using HLPs in that district. They might be used as sort of the content of induction, and identify some key practices, and then have mentors, as in the same kinds of ways James was talking about, work with those teachers throughout the induction period on refining those practices that are most important to them at that particular stage in their career. And that might be determined both by observations of others, by some that are identified as important for special educators or other teachers, and also by the teachers themselves who feel like they want to learn more about a particular practice.
There are a lot of really good comments about who you'll share this with, who do you think might find might find these most immediately useful. And one comment I would definitely like to underscore is that the entire school can benefit from this. It's not just special education teachers, but general education teachers and the school leaders and even the support specialists. So the speech language pathologists, the school psychologists. It's really great for everyone to have a common language to talk about some of the practices that they're implementing. And so that gives the whole staff an opportunity to come together around certain practices and come up with common language, because sometimes the practices that are being implemented are similar, but there's different language to talk about them. So sometimes it gets lost in translation. And that's been one of our focuses as a center, is to bring together special education, general education, and school leaders. What does EBP stand for? That's a great question. Evidence-based practices. So we see those as being more content specific, and the high leverage practices being a way to implement some of those more content specific strategies with practices that cut across grade level, content area, or context.
And then there's a question about what is the difference between HLPs and EBPSs?
So the high leverage practices are those high leverage practices. They're practices that should not be context or content specific. The evidence-based practices are typically tied to a content area or a certain domain of practice. And the high leverage practices, we can get teachers to use them with automaticity. It will help them deliver evidence-based practices in a given content area. Would you say that's fair, James?
Yes, yes, very much so.
So some examples of evidence-based practices, we typically go to literacy because there's such a strong evidence base or research base on literacy instruction, but making sure that we are providing that explicit instruction in the Big Five. So making sure that students have phonics instruction, they have good phonemic awareness, that is being tied to morphology so that they're able to make connections when they're learning new words. Those would be some quick examples of evidence-based practices for literacy. And then the high leverage practice is that explicit instruction piece that we're modeling, that we're giving them opportunities to practice with feedback. All right, we will keep moving. Thank you all for your questions and comments. Again, I mentioned those resources. Highleveragepractices.org was mentioned earlier. We also partner with the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders. They have practices and resources that you might find useful. The IRIS Center is another technical assistance center that you asked earlier about what some special education teachers might want to do to start digging into these right now. Their resources are fabulous. They have a lot of modules that you can work through independently, and they have a guide that tells you which of their resources align to which high leverage practices. So if you identified a few, as Bonnie suggested, you could go to iriscenter.com and really dig into some resources that will help you professionally develop in those specific areas. And then finally, CCSSO has a Supporting Inclusive Schools Principal Leaders Guide that you can download as well. You can go to their website. And as I mentioned, the book on the right, the High Leverage Practices in Special Education book, lays out all of the practices. It's free download on highleveragepractices.org. And then the book on the left is also available for purchase on that website, High Leverage Practices for Inclusive Classrooms. Each practice is broken down in great detail with examples of how to implement in the classroom. So speaking of the classroom, I'll turn it over to Bonnie to talk more about that direct support to teachers.
Oh, I'm sorry, it changed a little bit. Go back to that slide, Erica. Sorry. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about how principals and assistant principals might support teachers' use of HLPs. Prior to my faculty role, I worked for 8 years as a district administrator of special education, and I worked with a lot of principals and assistant principals in a suburban and an urban district. And I appreciated how many of the principals worked to support students with disabilities and their teachers, and so I'm really happy to talk with this audience. So special educators, like all teachers, see principal support as crucial to their work. Principals can make a big difference in teachers' effectiveness and their retention. And so foundational to this work in supporting an inclusive culture for students who struggle is emphasizing all teachers' responsibilities for teaching these students. And when principals voice that to all teachers in the school, emphasize the collaborative culture, that helps specialists like special education teachers or English ESL teachers do that work. Next slide. I want to take a moment though, because to talk about taking a walk in special educator shoes. Our special education teachers typically work across multiple grades and content areas, and they often teach across multiple settings. And this creates a special set of demands for these teachers as they have to know a lot of content plus coordinate that work across so many different settings. It requires a lot of organizational skills as well. Sometimes teachers are confused about whether to teach foundational skills like reading skills, the ones that Erica was talking about, as well as state standards. And so sometimes there's ambiguity about how do I spend my limited time with students. They also collaborate with numerous professional staff. They expect to do this work. They may support multi-tiered systems of support like James was talking about, and they also have to manage legal requirements of IDEA. So one thing we know about special education teachers is they truly do struggle with their roles. And one of the hardest things they have to do is managing all of these varied activities. So there isn't a template for this role as it operates in different ways in different schools, but they need to work with others to design those roles so that they can put these high leverage practices into practice. Next slide. So I want to focus first on teachers. So HLPs can really help be a form of support for them in terms of providing clarity about effective teaching practices. There's lots of lists out there about effective teaching practices, and it can be kind of confusing, but this really distills 22 practices that they need to be able to use and take them over time and learn them gradually. It also provides new teachers with a focus for instructional practices. And the nice thing is because they work across so many settings is that HLPs are relevant to all of the content areas they teach. It also, as Erica had mentioned, it provides a shared language. So when they have a shared language for practice, special educators can talk to other special educators about those practices and know what they mean, especially if they've been in professional development together. It can help them communicate with general education teachers and their principals as well. As it also sends coherent messages about instruction and what's important, and they can be relevant to one's own self-assessment. If these are the practices that are important to me, I can think about which ones I need to use, and they might use them for self-initiated PD. Next slide. HLPs can also help focus things up, previous slide, for leaders. HLPs may be used to support instructional leadership by clarifying what those effective practices are for special educators. So it kind of gets leaders and teachers on the same page as they talk about instruction. It can also help support leader-teacher conversations about instruction. And this is important because special educators sometimes say that they don't feel that their work is understood by others. So one teacher said, I am asked to use the Danielson framework. And so I got marked down during my evaluation because I wasn't using higher order thinking skills in that lesson. But I was using explicit instruction, which was important for this student to learn that lesson. So it can be used as part of informal assessments or possibly even formal assessments, although I don't know of too many about that use yet. It can also be used by principals to prioritize PD with teachers and also provide instructional support about particular ones and can be used to guide instruction. The next one. However, focusing on PD and teachers' ability to use HLPs isn't sufficient. Next slide. And this is because teachers need the working conditions to use HLPs. Special educators need the time, the schedules, and the materials to teach effectively. And they rely on general education teachers to teach their students. So collaboration HLPs can't be done just on their own. They must be done with other teachers, and so they need their cooperation. So the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the collaboration HLPs. As James mentioned, there were 3 collaborative HLPs: professional collaboration, in which teachers work with other teachers or related services providers to figure out what that instruction should look like for that student and how they're going to monitor that. They need to know how to run an effective meeting. There's lots of different ways to run a meeting, but we want to accomplish certain things in those meetings, and that came out as just an important dimension of teachers' practice. And the book that Erica mentioned has a lot of tools about running effective meetings around student learning. And of course, there's family collaboration. So these things require interpersonal and communication skills, but they also involve reviewing student data, identifying goals for learning, making instructional decisions, monitoring progress, and allocating responsibilities. So when you really kind of dive deep into some of these HLPs, there's a lot there to learn and to work through. Next slide. So knowing how to collaborate effectively can be a real challenge for teachers, and teachers may get together and not have a shared vision. So a teacher I know indicates that these 4 questions are used to guide collaboration in meetings for students who struggle in their school. And they begin with, what are the key goals for the student? And then they work backwards. What's the student's current level? How will the student meet the instructional goals? And this requires a lot of expertise to work through how that's going to happen and how that's going to be coordinated between perhaps working with different teachers. And how will the progress be monitored and assessed? That could be part of an MTSS or multi-tiered system as well. So having a framework for instructional decision-making can help in these collaborative IEPs. In the inclusion handbook that was mentioned earlier, there's some more examples. Next slide. So here are some challenges that teachers have with collaborating in schools. Without scheduled time, collaboration may happen only on the fly, as they can catch somebody for a few minutes to talk. There's sometimes a lack of teacher physical proximity to each other. So because they don't see other teachers, that on the fly work doesn't even happen. Sometimes general educators are reluctant to collaborate with special educators. It happens in some places, and that can make that work hard. And teachers may not share views about collaborative processes. So principals can help by really problem solving and supporting a collaborative ethic in the school. They can also help by organizing collaborative schedules and expectations. So in one large elementary school I know, the teachers reorganized themselves. The special education teachers were each assigned to a grade level team and sometimes 2 grade levels. And they participated in all of the grade level planning, and time was allocated during this time to address students who struggle. So just by changing the organization there, the principal worked with the teachers to make it built in to sort of the general routines that teachers will collaborate with each other. And there's lots of other ways of doing that, but it has to be deliberate, and it sometimes won't happen unless there's that upfront planning. So how leaders can help here, next slide, is that really do support a collaborative, inclusive culture and let teachers know that all students have a responsibility for students with disabilities or English language learners, and also support that general special education collaboration with PD and schedules that allow time for that work. And don't assume the collaboration will be viewed as a priority if people are left on their own. It may in some places, but I can tell you it won't happen in others. Or leave the scheduling to the special educator or the specialist to figure out. The SLT guide has, the inclusion guide also has some additional resources about this. So if we go to the next slide, special education teachers have demanding roles, and putting these requires other supports. And we've talked about a few of these. If you look at the center of this, Elizabeth Bettini at Boston University and her colleagues summarized some of these key points. They need those opportunities to learn through PD. They need opportunities to plan together with collegial support, but they also need opportunities to teach and dedicated time for special educators to get together some small groups so that they can do that explicit instruction. And they need that school culture and administrative support to make it happen. So HLPs are really important to being a skilled teacher, but they also need things to happen in that school setting that will allow them to use those practices. In summary, I hope that you will share some ideas here. What are some actions you might take to support the teacher collaboration HLPs? And also, what questions do you have about supporting teachers' use of SLPs in general in your school? So please write out some comments, and the three of us will try to address those.
So Hina shares that timely and effective communication with parents helps support students' learning.
It's very true. Very important. And that's one of the HLPs that we didn't talk about in detail, but is definitely critical and very important to students with disabilities, the IEP, and monitoring their instruction between home and school.
Well, it's certainly important too, I'll add, for students with disabilities, and we're seeing that, I know, in the state I live in Florida. There's a lot of information and nationally about the difficulty in moving to online instruction for students with disabilities of all ages now, and the need for parent involvement to really make that work and work well.
So I'm wondering what questions principals might have in terms of the putting HLPs into practice with teachers, or anything that you might have found that works really well in your school.
Lonnie, there's a question about how long should you take to learn and follow up on one high leverage practice. And that really depends on the particular practice, but a lot of evidence on professional development shows that it takes anywhere from 20 to 100 hours, depending on the complexity. So emphasizes the need to select a few practices and really focus on them in depth if students or teachers learn to use them, or to learn to use them in their classrooms. There's an interesting figure that Joyce and Showers did, who reviewed research on professional development, and it showed that practices where someone just talks about them are almost never used in a classroom. When people have simulations within professional development, maybe 5% of the time they are used in classrooms. But when there's active coaching and this time is spent, those numbers dramatically increase. So that if we don't include the coaching part of this and the additional time, then teachers are going to rarely use the practices. So very good question.
There was a comment that from Kristen that you can use teacher observations as an opportunity to recognize teachers' use of high leverage practices, also point out places where these practices may improve instruction. And it made me immediately think about the use of professional learning communities as well as lesson study cycles, so that you are capitalizing on the strengths of the teachers in your building and using those opportunities to allow peer coaching and mentoring.
You know, there are also opportunities, Erica, from the HLP videos that are on highleveragepractice.org. They provide examples of teachers using several. We haven't developed all those yet, but several of the high leverage practices. There are teachers using the practices are described. And I know in teacher prep programs, a number of people have used those with candidates who are preparing to become teachers to analyze the teacher practices presented in videos. So video analysis could be another way of getting at that too.
I think the IRIS resources address so many of these different IEPs. And if you type Iris Vanderbilt into Google and you go under resources, you can put in explicit instruction or working with parents or collaboration, and many different resources that have lots of additional resources are available to teachers in learning about those practices. And
here's another comment on giving teachers opportunities to learn from each other through peer observation, simulations, modeling, yeah, so forth. You all are certainly on the same page we are, I will say that.
There could also be teacher leadership with certain practices. For example, if a teacher is particularly strong in using explicit instruction in mathematics or in reading, they might be a resource to other teachers, and there might be a sharing of expertise among teachers within a district. So having some people who sort of specialize in some of these and who are willing to share and work with others can be a nice way of recognizing teachers who've really worked hard to develop expertise about particular practices.
Yeah.
Kim has a question that says, in regards to student achievement, which HLPs have had the most success for SWD?
Well, there is little doubt that explicit instruction, when used appropriately and effectively and students are engaged, can be very, very effective. Formative assessment can be as well, the importance of monitoring instruction and ensuring that students are learning, and if they're not, figuring out ways of changing instruction. Flexible grouping has also been shown to be very effective. Feedback. There are a number of these that have been shown to be quite effective for students with disabilities. Teaching them to use strategies under certain circumstances, especially upper elementary grades and as they get older. Strategies for learning has been shown to be effective as well. So there are several of them, but explicit instruction certainly is right up there. Formative assessment's right up there as far as the most effective practices for students. These are instructional practices that are delivered for relatively brief periods of time in small groups, and as I said, have to be highly engaging. I know there's been a lot of criticism, quite frankly, well-deserved criticism of explicit instruction when it's been used poorly. And of course, the other thing I will say is any of these practices can be used poorly. And if that's the case, obviously they will not be effective. So it's important that teachers understand how to use the practices effectively and also have settings where they can do that and have the time and the support so they can deliver the practices to the right size groups of students and so forth.
Another question that's come in, some teachers are reluctant to change their practices. What should we do in such circumstances?
That's a great question. And I've certainly worked with teachers who have been reluctant to change their practices. I personally find that sort of a gentle nudge, finding out what they are interested in doing, not being too much of directing that they must do it, but to kind of have openings, pair them with somebody else who might be interested in it, and maybe some of that will rub off, but we're always going to have teachers who may be reluctant to change a practice. I think sometimes, though, teachers will want to use a practice once they have some success with it, which is why sometimes the sit and get types of professional development don't work very well. But having teachers who have coaching on it over time might come to see the value of it. But it is challenging, and I try to go with strength, and then again keep nudging and creating opportunities for teachers to maybe interact with others about that practice.
Bonnie, if I could add one thing to that, I worked a lot with a teacher here in the Gainesville area who has a very, very effective inclusive school. And one of the things that she talked about a lot, and we actually wrote an article about this a few years ago, she was involved in that, was that her belief was if she didn't have data that she believed in and the teachers believed in regarding student progress, she really couldn't have a very reasonable conversation with a teacher, because she had to have data that they believed was accurate, reasonable data and timely data, and she believed it was, and then they could sit down and have a conversation. And if students in a teacher's class weren't making very much progress in writing or in reading or in math or whatever, then they needed to have a conversation about that. The other thing that she did, which I found interesting, she was very supportive in the way that she used the data. And she talked with the teacher about the fact, from her perspective, they needed to improve their practice, but she would provide professional support for doing that. She would collaborate with them to figure out the direction. I think a problem that we often have is that if we have one approach to address a problem rather than a variety of approaches, that we can collaborate with teachers and have them choose from among. And my experience has been when things are handled like that, most of the time, teachers will choose an approach and make progress. I'll save it for another day, but the principal also had a way of addressing it for those very few teachers who would not choose an approach and who refused to change. But I won't get into that right now.
I think it's helpful to understand, too, why people don't want to use a practice, because sometimes it might be that they think that, oh, this is just the latest thing, or I'm not going to have support for it, or I don't have materials to use it. And so I think that understanding why might provide some avenues for addressing it as well.
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence that indicates that, like Bonnie said earlier, until a teacher sees a practice work, they really will not believe in it. And I know I see some of you are talking about mindset, and I'm a little skeptical of mindset. I think mindsets can be changed if a teacher sees a practice that's effective. And you've mentioned a lot of ways of doing that. Going into another teacher's classroom that is really getting good outcomes with students, and seeing a practice and seeing how effective it is, talking to that teacher. There's a lot of research that shows that beliefs change after practice changes and not before. And there are several researchers that have demonstrated that. And I think if we focus too much on beliefs and not on practice, we're going to have a lot of difficulty. So I really think it's a way of kind of gently supporting teachers and figuring out ways they can gain insights into the fact that certain practices work and they are usable in their classrooms. And by visiting other classrooms is a great way of doing that, talking to other teachers who use the practice, as you all have said, as Bonnie said earlier.
Well, we are just about at the end of our time here. Thank you for all your comments. Thank you, James, Bonnie, and Erica, for a wonderful webinar on special ed. We've put up their email addresses. If you have further questions or would like to continue the conversation, please feel free to write to our speakers here. In the meantime, this webinar recording will be posted tomorrow afternoon on the NAESP website. So again, thank you everyone for this afternoon, and we hope to see you again in another webinar.
Thank you all.